Ladies and gentlemen, you're about to witness some scenes from the next attraction to play this theater. This picture, truly one of the most unusual ever filmed, contains scenes which under no circumstances should be viewed by anyone with a heart condition or anyone who is easily upset. We urgently recommend that if you are such a person or the parent of a young or impressionable child now in attendance, that you and the child leave the auditorium for the next 90 seconds.
Welcome to episode 10 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we combine two films to create something far greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are exploring the horrors of cannibalism, a subject that was once regarded as one of the ultimate cinematic taboos, but which has now become a strangely prevalent subgenre. First up, we have our inaugural Mexican film of the series, with Jorge Michel Grau's We Are What We Are from 2010. Set in an impoverished barrio of Mexico City, this film follows a family of cannibals who have to adapt to a new way of life after the death of their patriarch. After that, we're going to be heading over to France and 2016's Raw, the feature debut from multi-award-winning director Julia Ducournau, which follows the cannibalistic awakenings of a young girl in her first term at university. Both of this week's films have much to say about the nature of humanity, family relationships, sexuality, transgression, and metamorphosis. Along the journey, we'll also be falling down quite a few rabbit holes and discussing cannibalism in history, literature, and cinema, so you probably don't want to be eating as you listen to this week's episode. As you can tell from that summary, this is shaping up to be rather a packed episode of the series, and probably another long one. So I'm going to begin by listing just the main sources that I've used as a reference. As always though, all references used will be listed or linked in the show notes. For our first film, We Are What We Are, the main references have been interviews with Jorge Michel Grau on comingsoon.net, indiewire.com, Jordana.com, hypermediamagazine.com, and letralibres.com, as well as in Toma magazine. And for Raw, the main references have been interviews with Julia Ducournau that are available on bfi.org.uk, screenanarchy.com, focusfeatures.com, and filmcomment.com, as well as the websites for the British newspapers The Guardian and The Independent. I've also referred to several video interviews and Q&A sessions that Ducournau conducted at various film premieres, and these are all available on YouTube and will again be listed and linked in the show notes. The act of consuming another individual of the same species for food is a fairly common interaction in the animal kingdom and has been recorded in over 1,500 species. Human cannibalism, or to give it the correct scientific term, anthropophagy, is also well documented, both in ancient and also recent times. The earliest documented evidence dates back nearly 1.5 million years to a region of Kenya, and this consists of very defined cut marks being discovered on a shin bone. Whilst older and more controversial evidence certainly does exist, this is by all accounts the earliest unambiguous sign of tool-assisted butchery, suggesting some form of preparation for consumption. The practice has also been well documented in other parts of the world, including Fiji, the Amazon Basin, the Congo, New Guinea, and parts of the Solomon Islands. Human flesh was sold at markets in some parts of Melanesia and also in the Congo Basin. And just before my European listeners get all arrogant and self-righteous, there was also a form of cannibalism that was very popular in early modern Europe. This involved the consumption of body parts or blood for medicinal purposes, and this reached its heights in the 17th century, though the practice also continued, in some areas, into the second half of the 19th century. So, all things considered, not really that long ago. It probably comes as no surprise then that the concept has found its way into art and literature, dating back to Greek and Roman mythology, if not even further. Often presented as a symbol of moral collapse or rebellion, and sometimes revenge, we first see it occur in the story of Kronos, the father of all of the gods, who swallowed his children for fear that they would grow to overthrow him. This narrative was famously, and quite horrifically, depicted by the artist Francisco Goya in his series of black paintings. However, one could argue that technically this was not really cannibalism at all. Kronos swallowed his children whole, rather than devouring them, as depicted in the Goya painting, and they existed whole and intact in his stomach. He was also later tricked into regurgitating them, leading to the fulfillment of the prophecy and the birth of the Greek gods. Perhaps more relevant is the story of Tantalus, a mortal king who wanted to test the omnipotence of the gods. And what more natural way to do this than to kill and cook his own child, and then serve it to the gods at dinner, to see if they would be able to identify that they were eating human flesh. The gods, bar one, were not tricked, and they punished Tantalus with an eternal torment in the underworld. He was cast into a pool of water from which he could never drink, and was surrounded by fruit trees from which he could never eat, a punishment from which we get the word tantalize. The Greeks also gave us the story of the Feast of Thyestes, and this is a particularly grim family drama in which King Thyestes unknowingly eats his own sons when they are served to him in a stew. This narrative conceit would be referenced in multiple forms of media, including Shakespeare's play Titus Andronicus, and this in itself was brilliantly pastiched in the Vincent Price movie Theatre of Blood. More recently, of course, we've also seen this referenced in Game of Thrones. Cannibalism is also mentioned in the Bible, wherein it is depicted as either a curse or, more likely, an act of desperation in times of war or famine, and this latter reality would find its way into popular culture, most notably the fairy tales of the aptly named Brothers Grimm. As we know, their stories have far less to do with their Disney incarnations and much more to do with the harsh realities of life in medieval Europe. The tale of Hansel and Gretel, for example, with its children dumped in the woods and a cannibalistic witch, was originally far less about the bravery of its child protagonists and much more likely an analogy for the Great Famine that occurred in Europe between the years of 1315 and 1322. Across these 7 years, a prolonged period of wet and cold weather led to crop failure, food shortages, and widespread starvation. In many cases, families resorted to extreme measures to survive, including child abandonment and, according to historical sources, cannibalism. However, it would not be until the 19th century that we would see themes of cannibalism appear in genre literature, with Edgar Allan Poe's only complete novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, published in 1838. This featured scenes of cannibalism as a means of survival, something that would be lightly referenced in a blink and you miss it moment by Mike Flanagan in his Poe anthology series House of Usher in 2023. Poe's tale actually had a historical context, and one that would also inspire the writer Herman Melville to write his whaling epic Moby Dick. This was the story of the whaling ship the Essex, which was attacked and ultimately sunk by a sperm whale in 1820, and some may well say that's poetic justice. The survivors, adrift in lifeboats for 92 days, resorted to murder and cannibalism, though once they were finally rescued, there was in fact very little judgment passed, with their actions, committed in the most dire of circumstances, seen more as a custom of the sea. Bizarrely though, there was reportedly far more judgment for the ship's captain, who, in eating his own cousin, was seen as committing a form of gastronomic incest. Now, whether this last part is completely true or not, I'm not 100% sure, but if it is, it highlights a very strange double standard indeed. 26 years later, history would offer another notorious example of the desperate lengths to which humans will go to survive, and this is, of course, the infamous story of the Donner Party. This was a group of American pioneers traveling by wagon train from the Midwest to California. Delayed by a series of misfortunes, they became snowbound in the Sierra Nevada mountains during the winter of 1846 to 1847. As starvation and exposure took their toll, some resorted to cannibalism, primarily consuming the bodies of those who had already died from hunger, illness, or the cold. However, in one harrowing instance, 2 Native American guides were also murdered and eaten. 30 years later, a similar story, albeit on a smaller scale, occurred with the case of Alfred Greiner Packer, who was later dubbed the Colorado Cannibal. He was an American prospector and also a self-proclaimed wilderness guide, and he confessed to cannibalism in the winter of 1874, when he emerged as the sole survivor of a 6-man expedition attempting to cross the mountains in Colorado. However, his story changed several times, and no definitive evidence ever confirmed exactly what had happened. When his story was questioned, Packer escaped from jail, and he spent 9 years on the run. He was eventually apprehended and convicted of premeditated murder, receiving a death sentence. On retrial, this was commuted to 40 years in prison on 5 counts of voluntary manslaughter. Whether his version of events was true or not, he remains one of only 4 people in American history to have been convicted of cannibalism. His story has inspired 3 films: The Legend of Alfred Packer in 1980, the comedic Cannibal, the musical, in 1993, and the film Ravenous in 1999, which was directed by Antonia Bird and stars Guy Pearce, Robert Carlyle, and David Arquette. And very good it is too. There is one more notorious historical incident of cannibalism that I'm going to mention here, but only because it's inspired several films and genre novels. It's actually highly likely to be a work of fiction in and of itself, and is also highly likely to be a piece of anti-Scottish propaganda that was spread by the English, and quite frankly, I wouldn't put it past us. This is the legend of Sawney Bean, the supposed head of a 45-member clan of cannibals in Scotland in the 16th century. They were said to have murdered and cannibalised over 1,000 people across a 25-year period, which is quite an impressive number, all things considered. Given the scale of the alleged crimes, it's rather astonishing, really, that there is absolutely no evidence or documentation to support the myth whatsoever. Even more suspiciously, the story first appeared in an 18th century publication called the Newgate Calendar, which was a lurid crime journal with more than a passing resemblance to the National Enquirer, or, if you're in the UK, the Sunday Sport. In short, it's probably complete garbage. Nevertheless, the legend has had a surprisingly long afterlife. It helped inspire Wes Craven's 1977 film The Hills Have Eyes, as well as Jack Ketchum's 1980 debut novel, Off Season, and, in my opinion, also a not very good film at all, called Sawney, Flesh of Man, that was released in 2012. Moving into the 20th century, we have what I think is one of the earliest mentions of cannibalism, not as a means of survival, but instead as a tool of horror, and this is in the story The Rats in the Walls, by H.P. Lovecraft, which was published in 1924. This story contains a particularly unpleasant revelation about the omnivorous tendencies of the narrator's family line, and indeed about the narrator himself, taking the theme of cannibalism away from the notion of necessary evil and into something far darker and much more primal. 8 years later, this idea would be expanded on in the first of our cinematic entries, which I believe is the earliest reference to cannibalism in horror cinema, or certainly the earliest that I've been able to find. This is the movie Dr. X, which was released in 1932, and which stars Lionel Atwill and Fay Wray. Being completely honest, I had never heard of this film before researching this episode, and I only managed to track down an online copy a week ago when I was starting to do my research. But I have to say, I really enjoyed it. Produced and released before the notorious Hays censorship code was enforced, it is really quite a nasty piece of work, and it was released in two versions, one in black and white and the other in two-colour Technicolor. It tells the story of a series of cannibalistic murders committed in New York and triggered by the full moon. The titular character, Dr. Xavier, launches an investigation, which focuses on a group of scientists working at his research lab. It was a very popular film at the time, the success of which led to the pairing of Atwill and Wray in a much more well-known movie 1 year later, and that's The Mystery of the Wax Museum in 1933. There was also an in-name only sequel called The Return of Dr. X, which was released in 1939. This starred, rather improbably, Humphrey Bogart in his only horror role, something that he was contractually obliged to do and which he apparently hated with a passion. The Hays Code, officially known as the Motion Picture Production Code, came into force in 1934 and ran until 1968. So perhaps unsurprisingly, I've not really been able to find any more references in horror cinema until the 1960s, and this was with the release of the world's first gore movie. This movie is, of course, Blood Feast, directed by Herschel Gordon Lewis and released onto the drive-in circuit in 1963. It is a terrible, terrible, terrible film, even by the director's own admission, and he's often compared it to a Walt Whitman poem, saying, quote, "It's no good, but it's the first of its type, and therefore it deserves a certain position." End quote. Herschel Gordon Lewis was, judging from his interviews, an incredibly witty and self-aware man, and he went on to create a number of drive-in splatter movies, including 2000 Maniacs in 1964, Colour Me Blood Red in 1965, and The Wizard of Gore in 1970. Meanwhile, in 1968, another independent filmmaker was creating a low-budget horror movie that would push the idea of cannibalism into the mainstream, and also kickstart the modern zombie genre. I am, of course, referring to George A. Romero and his movie Night of the Living Dead. Until Romero, the movie trope of the zombie had stayed relatively close to its origins, transported from its home in Haiti by the American explorer William S. Seabrook in his book The Magic Island. This book allegedly documented his time spent in Haiti and is considered to be the first English-language work to describe the idea of a zombie. I'm not going to go into the incredibly problematic nature of Seabrook's book today, because we would be here for a very, very long time, but it would, for better or worse, have a significant impact on the horror genre, spawning the first feature-length zombie movie, Bela Lugosi's White Zombie, in 1932. Romero's zombies are of course a very different proposition, revived not through magic or ritual, but most likely through cosmic radiation, and also developing a taste for human flesh, something that would be brutally depicted in the film's most notorious moments. This, of course, would become a staple of the horror genre from the 1970s onwards, both through Romero's later works and the plethora of Italian variants that would invade cinema screens and home video, as producers sought to wring as much profit as they could from the growing trend. Another adjacent trend emerging from Italy, and one that would also continue into the 1980s, was the cannibal exploitation movie, which began with Umberto Lenzi's film The Man from Deep River in 1972. Lenzi's movie sets up several of the tropes of the genre that would be repeated ad nauseum over the following decade. Western explorers, most often photographers or documentary makers, are captured in the jungle by tribespeople and subjected to any number of horrific incidents. Under the Fellone principles of Italian cinema that we discussed in episode 5, the success of each film contributed to the creation of the next, each becoming more and more violent. Entries into this subgenre include the notorious Cannibal Holocaust, as well as Prisoners of the Cannibal God and Cannibal Ferox. They are extremely violent films, not least in their willingness to slaughter wildlife for real on screen, and unsurprisingly they were mostly banned in the UK during the video nasties debacle of the early 1980s, and I have to say, I'm really not a fan. Closer to home, and perhaps closer in theme to the first of our movies this week, in 1972, American director Gary Sherman made the film Deathline, which was released in the US under the more exploitative title of Raw Meat. As much of an attack on the British establishment as it is a horror film, Deathline stars the great Donald Pleasance as a world-weary police inspector investigating a series of murders on the London Underground. His investigation uncovers that the culprit is the last remaining descendant of a group of Victorian underground workers who were trapped in a cave-in. Rather than rescue them, which was considered far too expensive, the establishment left them behind to die and rot, and even a century later are still eager to maintain the cover-up. 2 years later, Tobe Hooper gave us the cannibalistic Sawyer family in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and in the same year, back in the UK, exploitation director Pete Walker released Frightmare, a brilliantly depressing movie about a cannibal mother that we discussed in depth back in episode 3. As mentioned earlier, the 1970s also gave us The Hills Have Eyes from director Wes Craven, but it also gave us a lesser-known movie called Welcome to Arrow Beach, which was released as Tender Flesh. This movie starred Lawrence Harvey as a Korean War veteran who developed a taste for human meat during the war and is now unable to control his urges. The rather arrogant notion of human beings as a somehow addictive and irresistible delicacy was also used as a plot device in the 1980 Hammer House of Horror TV series. In the episode The 13th Reunion, a health farm acts as a cover-up for all sorts of dark and nasty goings-on. This was seemingly inspired, rather tastelessly, if you'll forgive the expression, on the 1972 plane disaster involving Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, which crashed into the Andes and would not be found for 72 days. This left the survivors no option but to consume the bodies of some of the dead, and it's a scenario that would be handled far more sensitively in the 1993 movie Alive, directed by Frank Marshall and starring Ethan Hawke, and also in the Oscar-nominated film Society of the Snow from 2023. The incident would also inspire the recent TV series Yellow Jackets, which stars Juliette Lewis and Christina Ricci as the grown-up survivors of a similar accident. The 1980s, of course, also saw the rise of possibly the best-known cannibal of all, Dr. Hannibal Lecter, also known as Hannibal the Cannibal. He made his first appearance in Thomas Harris's 1981 novel Red Dragon, which was adapted into the 1986 movie Manhunter. He then had a bigger role in the 1988 follow-up The Silence of the Lambs, which, as we all know, was made into the Anthony Hopkins and Jodie Foster Behemoth in 1991. Sadly, though, Harris couldn't leave well enough alone, and the character would return to far lesser effect in the novel Hannibal in 1999 and a prequel titled Hannibal Rising in 2006. These were, of course, also adapted by Hollywood in 2001 and 2007 respectively. There was also a TV series which, in my opinion, was rather better, and which starred Mads Mikkelsen and ran on NBC between 2013 and 2015. But whilst many of these films played with cannibalism as the ultimate taboo, few had that much to really say about it. It was nasty, it was horrible, it was shocking, it was monstrous, and that was about it. An exception to all of this emerged in 2006, when Cormac McCarthy released his Pulitzer Prize-winning post-apocalyptic novel The Road, wherein cannibalism is depicted not only as a means of survival during times of desperation, but also, more importantly, as a metaphor for moral decay, the downfall of humanity, and the delineation between good and evil. It was adapted into a film in 2009, starring Viggo Mortensen, Cozy Smith-McPhee, Guy Pearce and Charlize Theron, and is an extremely good movie, though, as you can imagine, it's not exactly a light and enjoyable watch. All of which brings us to 2010, and the first of this week's movies, which in Spanish is called Somos lo que hay, but its English title is We Are What We Are. It was directed by Jorge Michel Grau and stars Francisco Barrero, Paulina Gaetan, Alan Chavez, and Carmen Bito. And as regular listeners will know by now, it's around this time in the episode that I get into spoilers. So if you haven't seen the movie, it's available to watch on Apple TV and Amazon Prime. And just as a reminder, I'm discussing the original Mexican version, and not the US remake from 2013, though I will be touching on this adaptation a little bit later. We Are What We Are is the debut feature from director Jorge Michel Grau, a writer-director hailing from Mexico City. His love of cinema began in a rather personal setting. His father owned a video rental store. When a large chain, something similar to Blockbuster, moved into the neighborhood, the family business couldn't compete and sadly eventually folded. But there was a silver lining. Grau's father bought the entire stock of films home, and from that point on, Jorge and his brother immersed themselves in movies, often watching 2 a day, a kind of informal and self-directed film academy. Interestingly though, he didn't set out to be a filmmaker. He first studied communication science at university and began a career producing documentaries and television. It was only after helping a friend with a film for their thesis that he recognised the pull of cinema was something that was actually far more than a hobby. He made a very brave decision to leave his job and return to his parents' home, enrolling in the renowned CCC Film Training Centre, surrounded, as he later noted, by 18-year-olds who were just starting out. Even then, he quickly developed a reputation for a taste in cinema that didn't shy away from brutality, violence, or provocation. Graduating with honours, he built a name for himself with a series of very striking short films. His documentary Calimán won the Best Mexican Short Documentary, while his fiction short, Más Bonita que Tú, or Prettier Than Thou, took home the top prize at a festival in Marseille. Grau conceived We Are What We Are as an allegory of familial and societal collapse. His main intention was to examine the breakdown of the central family as a reflection of Mexico's broader social fragmentation and disintegration. As he himself explained in interviews, he made the metaphor intentionally explicit, saying, quote, "The metaphor of the film is that man is the wolf of man, and that we are our own cannibals." End quote. The film makes its intentions clear from the very first scene. We open on the interior of a shopping mall, a very sterile and joyless space, which feels more in line with early Cronenberg than any bustling and enticing shopping centre. Shopping mall music drones in the background as a dishevelled and grimy figure shuffles slowly through the empty corridors. The setting, the shopping mall music, and the man's zombie-like gait feel very much like a nod to George A. Romero's Dawn of the Dead and its commentary on consumerism, and given Grau's love of 1970s horror, this hardly seems to be coincidental. As the man lingers in front of a shop window, staring at the mannequin posed inside, an assistant quickly moves him along. When he finally collapses, retching blood onto the mall floor, there's no panic, there's no assistance, just the quiet efficiency of a pair of security guards dragging him out of sight, followed by a cleaner who wipes the space clean, as though he were never there at all. And all of this before we get to the opening titles. After the opening title card, we are then introduced to our principal character, Alfredo, the oldest son in the family, played by Francisco Barrero. Barrero, who had worked with Grau on some of his film projects at the CCC Film School, was 25 at the time of filming, though to be fair, he presents as much younger. Listeners may also recognise him from the 2012 movie Here Comes the Devil, which is a possession film that would have fit quite nicely into our episode about evil children a few weeks ago, and which has also been described as a film about the worst parents in the world. Alfredo, despite being the eldest in the family, seems very much the family whipping boy and an outsider, crouching and shrinking into himself when his mother loses her temper. He is, however, as his sister Sabina tells him, the most capable, the most sensitive, and the most balanced member of the family. We then meet his mother, Patricia, played by the actress Carmen Beto, who is a very well-known performer in Mexico. She initially agreed to make the movie, providing that it wasn't too bloody, although Grau would later say that when it came to shooting, she would actually request that more blood be put on her. As the matriarch of the family, she is distant and abusive, telling her youngest son that the family are monsters, and offering no comfort to Alfredo as he cries for his dead father. She is also responsible for some of the most startling acts of violence in the film, and she is so committed to the cannibalistic ritual that she is prepared to abandon her children in order to maintain it. Between she and her husband, it's really no wonder that the children have grown up to be the way that they are. Making up the remainder of the family are the youngest brother Julian, played by Alan Chavez, and the middle child Sabina, played by Paulina Gaetan. Alan Chavez was very sadly killed by gunfire in a confrontation with police just shortly after filming was completed, and a dedication appears to him in the opening credits of the movie. The family dynamic and the relationship between the two brothers was based, thankfully loosely, on Grau's own childhood. His father was absent through most of his childhood, leaving for work at 6 every morning and returning after 9 p.m. His closest connections were with his mother and grandmother, and he recalls that his relationship with his brother was characterized by a degree of tension and rivalry, but also a lot of love. We can see this mirrored in the relationship between the two brothers in the film. While Alfredo is serious and withdrawn, Julian is wild and feral, starting fights in the market, insulting his brother's sexuality, and exploding in outbursts of violence. But as the film progresses, we learn that, despite their differences, the two have always been close, and it is Julian who defends Alfredo to their mother when she condemns him for being weak. If Alfredo is the heart of the family, and Julian the muscle, then the brains belong to their sister Sabina, played by Paulina Gaetan. Gaetan was arguably the best known of the three at the time of filming, thanks to her role in the 2009 movie Sin Nombre, which was directed by Cary Fukunaga. She brings an intelligence and power to her performance as Sabina, pushing Alfredo into his new role as the head of the family, and telling her brothers to remember who they are talking to when they step out of line. In interviews at the time of the film's release, Gaetan explained that Sabina's stoicism was partly her own contribution, with both she and the director agreeing that she should speak very little and let her actions and eyes communicate her dominance. It's also implied at several points in the film that Julian and Sabina have an incestuous relationship, and this not only highlights the insular and animalistic nature of the family, but also makes Alfredo even more of an outsider, though more on that in a moment. Once he had his cast in place, Grau sent them on extensive research, and this included going to morgues to see autopsies and to learn how instruments are used to break people's bones. The family dynamic between the cast was then strengthened by an extensive rehearsal period, caused as a result of the 2009 H1N1 pandemic. Although this delayed filming for several weeks, Grau took the opportunity to conduct lengthy isolation exercises to experiment with the characters' emotions and lives and create a sense of entrapment and claustrophobia. 1 week before filming, the cast and director all stayed in the same limited one-room space for the entire week, an activity that allowed Grau to generate a bond between them. He went on to say, quote, "By living together in a space where they had to eat together, go to the bathroom together, it generated an utter lack of privacy, a certain friction and hatred among them, so that they could be able to live the experience of the characters, who love each other intensely, but greatly desire to escape one another and remove themselves from the family structure." End quote. This idea of imprisonment, or being trapped, is repeated visually throughout the film, with characters filmed from behind the bars of these stalls in the market, or endlessly staring out of windows, such as the first time we see Alfredo. Grau's intention in the film was for the family to have a normal dynamic inside the house, but when exposed to the outside world, they would be completely disjointed, exhibiting violence and erratic behavior. This was not just an artistic choice, but also informed by research into the effects of their diet, with Grau asking nutritionists what would happen if somebody ate human flesh every day. One of the things that was emphasized was the change in attitude. He was told that they would be very violent people, and that they would exhibit behavior that, to anyone else, would be extremely out of the ordinary. We never find out the purpose of the ritual, or of its origins, but we do discover that the family believe that without it, they will start shaking and die. For Grau, cannibalism is a symbol of societal decay and the collapse of urban Mexican society as a whole, saying in interviews, quote, "In a country where there's about 40 to 50 murders on a daily basis, unless you belong to a tribal structure that will protect you, it will be a very dangerous situation. What we have in Mexico City is something like a kidnapping industry, where the kidnappers, we found out, tend to be police officers. So there's a sense among the general population of lack of protection. And this sort of sense of violence that permeates the city is something that we see in the film. The disintegration of the family structure depicted in the film is a metaphor for the larger disintegration of the social fabric, where people don't really know each other anymore." End quote. As well as the disintegration, what Grau wanted to reflect then was a tribal societal structure, one of tribes that survive by preying on others, or literally eating them, and a society where if you try to exist outside of these structures, you are on your own and doomed. And so in the movie, we see various groups and tribes that attempt to protect each other from external attacks. The street kids under the bridge, the sex workers who end up wreaking revenge on the mother Patricia as she attempts to flee, and the gay teenagers in the nightclub. Each of these are distinct and separate groups, only meeting in violence, destruction, and sexual contact. A compelling layer of the movie, of course, lies in the gay coding of the character of Alfredo. From the beginning, he comes across as quiet and sensitive, unwilling to take on the hyper-masculine role that his father left behind, and the role which his family expects him to adopt. Reviewers have observed that there is an undercurrent of subtle disgust and disappointment towards Alfredo from his mother and his brother, a tension that doesn't fully make sense until later in the story. As the narrative unfolds, we discover that Alfredo is sexually attracted to men, something that his ultra-macho family view as a weakness. The pivotal moment in Alfredo's arc comes when he is pushed by Sabina to find a victim for the family's ritual on his own. He encounters a young man in the subway and, implicitly drawn to him, decides to bring him home as the next offering, an incident that links the idea of sex with the idea of consumption. When the family sees that the intended victim is a boy, they react with open bigotry, hurling anti-gay slurs. In this intense moment of confrontation, he finally stands up for himself and has an honest conversation with his mother about his sexuality, marking a turning point in the film and for his character. "Why have you always hated me?" he cries at one point. "Why did you make me this way?" And we are no longer sure if he means his cannibalism or his sexual orientation. His mother simply responds that he was born this way. And again, we are unsure as to what exactly she is referring. On one level, the family's cannibalistic ritual can be interpreted as a dark metaphor for living with a hidden secret or a quote-unquote unnatural desire in a conservative household. The family's insistence on survival at all costs, saying that they must keep their tradition, mirrors how repressive families often prioritize appearances and traditions over the acceptance of their children's true identities. As one critic noted, We Are What We Are can be enjoyed purely as a cannibal horror story, or you can go really all in and watch a horror movie that delves into same-sex attraction and how it is or isn't accepted. Visually, the film's colour palette reflects the themes of decay, with most of the scenes lit in yellows and very watery greens. Working with director of photography Santiago Sanchez, also making his debut feature, Grau had two key intentions. The first, that he wanted to create a sense of claustrophobia and a sense of entrapment, and the second, that he wanted very low levels of lighting, low enough that the audience would have to make an effort to see what was going on, which, to be honest, they certainly managed to achieve. Within these tight constraints, Sanchez delivered a very striking visual style. He chose to shoot in widescreen, which might seem counterintuitive for a film so concerned with confinement, but instead it enhances the feeling of being trapped within an oppressive world. Most impressively, the entire film was lit with just 4 lights on set. Despite this minimal setup, the visuals are often oddly beautiful, most notably during the family ritual scene, which is shot through sheets of translucent plastic. The effect is dreamlike, even poetic, despite the horrific nature of what's unfolding behind the screens. For a film that centres around cannibalism, We Are What We Are is remarkably low on graphic violence. The director explained that he chose to initiate violent scenes on camera, but then hide the climax, either behind a wall, behind furniture, or behind plastic or curtains, so that each viewer's mind would fill in the details, with whatever degree of brutality they could tolerate. That being said, the special makeup effects, courtesy of Mexican special effects artist Alejandro Vasquez, earned the film a nomination for Best Special Effects at the Ariel Awards, an annual event that recognizes artistic and technical excellence in the Mexican film industry. The scenes in the morgue and with the cops are of course a pointed critique of attitudes towards crime and policing. The morgue attendants state that it is shocking how many people eat each other in the city, highlighting that the police reports blame the rats, but that the crimes are committed by, quote-unquote, the two-legged kind. The police aren't interested in the evidence that the coroners have to show them, saying they don't solve old cases, or new ones either, unless the case will make them famous or rich. And while we're on the subject of the morgue attendants, Grau has left here an Easter egg for fans of Mexican genre cinema. As a fan of Guillermo del Toro, and in particular of his debut film Cronos, Grau decided to cast 2 actors from that movie in the same roles. These are the performers Juan Carlos Colombo and Daniel Jimenez Cacho, and they are literally reprising their roles from Cronos, only now they are met by a cannibal instead of a vampire. This is a lovely tribute and Easter egg to a film which Grau says helped shape his generation of filmmakers. We Are What We Are premiered in March 2010 at the Guadalajara International Film Festival and quickly gained traction on the international circuit. Just a few months later, it was selected for the Directors' Fortnight at Cannes, where it competed for Best First Feature. The film was well received, selling to distributors in 11 territories after its screening at the festival. Back home in Mexico, as the director put it, the film practically divided the press. Released domestically in December 2010 on around 30 screens, it didn't break box office records, but it did quickly build a cult following. Internationally, it made an even stronger impression, winning awards at Fantasia and Fantastic Fest, to name but 2. In the States, the film was picked up by IFC Midnight and released in late 2010 with a limited theatrical run in early 2011. In the UK, it premiered at Fright Fest in London and was released by Artificial Eye in November of the same year. A US remake of the movie was released, also titled We Are What We Are, and this starred Amber Childers, Bill Sage, and Julia Garner. This is actually a very well made and respectful reimagining of the original story, directed by Jim Mickle, which takes the basic concept of a cannibalistic family but pushes it into entirely new directions, not least of all in terms of gender. There are those online who claim that the remake is somehow better, but personally I think it's just a very different film, and one that shows what a remake can achieve if the writers and directors have respect for the original, but their own imagination and story to tell. Grau himself is a fan of the remake too, saying in an interview that he also feels it to be a very different movie, and that he loves the feminism of its universe, going on to state that whilst his movie is very pessimistic in its view of the family, the remake does the opposite and brings the family closer. In my opinion, you can easily watch both films together and get something different from each, and in a world where cinema does indeed cannibalize itself, that's a very rare thing indeed. So we're now moving away from Mexico and heading across the Atlantic to France for the second of this week's films. This is Raw from 2016, directed by Julia Ducournau and starring Garance Marillier, Ella Rumpf and Rabah Nate Ufela. Again, we are going to get into spoilers quite quickly with this one, so if you want to watch the film before continuing and are in the UK, you can find it in the usual places and also for free, albeit with adverts, on the streaming service Tubi. Julia Ducournau was born in Paris in 1983. Her parents are both doctors, her mother a gynecologist and her father a dermatologist. So she grew up in a home where frank discussions of the human body and mortality were fairly common. This background has, without question, gone on to inform her film work, most notably her approach to the body, physicality and transformation. She studied screenwriting at the prestigious La Famille School in Paris, and in 2011, while still a student, wrote and directed a short film called Junior. This tells the story of Justine, played by Garance Marillier, a teenager who undergoes a grotesque physical transformation after catching a stomach bug. It premiered in the Critics' Week section at the 2011 Cannes Film Festival, where it won the Petit Rail d'Or, with critics praising its mixture of dark humour and bodily metamorphosis. She followed this film with a TV movie called Mange, which she co-directed with Virgilie Bramley, but it was in 2016 that she made a significant splash on the international stage with her feature debut, Raw. This also stars Garance Marillier as a student, again called Justine, who experiences a very unexpected awakening after a violent hazing ritual in her first week at veterinary school. By the way, the repetition of the name Justine in both films is not coincidental, and is a reference to the titular character in the novel Justine by the Marquis de Sade. Marillier would also go on to play a third character with the name in Ducournau's second feature, the award-winning Titan, released in 2021, and it would appear that this repetition of names is somewhat of a motif for the director. Characters called Alexia and Adrian also appear in both Raw and Titan, and the name Adrian appears again in the soon-to-be-released Alpha, which is the director's third movie. According to Ducournau, the rationale for this is that she considers the characters to be mutations of the same person, and it's interesting to watch her films with this in mind. The inspiration for Raw came to her during a conversation with a friend, who would later become the film's producer. They were discussing cannibal horror movies, and she observed that in most of them, particularly the Italian ones from the 1970s, the cannibals are very much othered. They are quote-unquote tribal savages, or monsters such as zombies or aliens. To her, this made no sense. Cannibalism is, as we all know, a real act, committed by real people, and she decided that were she to make a cannibal film, she wanted to depict that reality, and to explore what it is that makes somebody cross that line into the ultimate darkness. This darkness is something that has been explored to varying degrees of success and extremity in French cinema before. Jean-Luc Godard's apocalyptic and Marxist treatise Weekend from 1968 has people resort to cannibalism as the world falls apart in a series of traffic jams and car accidents. And in this movie, he suggests that when society collapses, we will end up consuming each other. In 2001, the director Claire Denis released her art house shocker Trouble Every Day, featuring the always mesmerizing Béatrice Dalle as a woman who becomes cannibalistic when sexually aroused. This film caused a huge controversy when first released, and as with many such films, caused audience walkouts and condemnation when screened at Cannes. And to be fair, it is a very violent film, though much of the offence taken seems to stem from the fact that Denis was, until that point at least, a darling of the art house set. Audiences and critics really couldn't comprehend why she was making a horror film, and, in a case of "please stay in your box, Madam Director," reacted accordingly. Now seen as part of the new French extremity movement of the early 2000s, it was followed the next year by the movie In My Skin, in which writer, director and star Marina Devin plays a woman who starts to self-harm and self-cannibalise. Full confession time, I found this movie an incredibly hard watch, and I have to say that I really couldn't make it all the way through. It's a very well made film, and I'm sure it has much to say, but it just isn't made for me. More up my street, though just as troubling in many ways, is the movie Frontière from director Xavier Gen, which was released in 2007. In this movie, a group of friends, on the run from the police following a botched robbery, are captured and tortured by a family of neo-Nazi cannibals. Again, it is a very violent work, but it's also as much a critique of French far-right politics and the actions of the then Interior Minister Nicolas Sarkozy as it is a horror movie. In Raw, though, the question is perhaps less political and more metaphysical. Unlike the new French extremity movement, which went out of its way to shock, Julia Ducournau's aim was not to be gratuitous or to merely provoke, as this is something that she has said in interviews she finds rather reductive. Her intent was to explore the concept of humanity by confronting our darkest selves. Raw is essentially a meditation on what makes us human, something which she says is a recurrent theme in her work, and we'll speak on that a little bit later. The screenplay took 3 years to write and was an exercise in precision. According to Ducournau, her screenplays are very detailed and are almost already edited, with what you see on the screen almost exactly what you would read on the page. The film opens with a sequence of a car accident, composed mainly of 3 long and relatively silent shots. An unidentified figure walks slowly down a deserted country road. A car approaches. The figure, now hiding unseen behind a tree, suddenly leaps into the road and causes the driver to crash. After a few moments, the still unidentified figure stands, brushes themselves off, and approaches the car. And just as they approach the door, the title card announces the film. There is no explanation, no exposition. If we did not know the subject matter of the movie, it may just be a particularly self-destructive form of carjacking. Immediately, we are then introduced to Justine, ordering mashed potatoes in a motorway services. We learn very quickly that she and her family are strict vegetarian, though the reason for this does not become apparent until later. She is on her way to veterinary school, the same one that her parents attended, and also the place where they first met. As I mentioned, Justine is played by the actress Gariance Marillier, and her performance is central to the film's success. She first worked with Ducournau when she was just 12 years old, and the director has joked that from that moment she knew 3 things immediately. 1, the actress was going to be a massive pain in the arse. 2, she was going to love her anyway. And 3, she was going to become an incredible actress. She was incredibly struck by a natural rhythm to the way that the actress spoke, which was almost a kind of inner music, and this meant that she always hits the right emotional note for a character without ever forcing it. But what really drew the director in, though, was Garance's physicality as a performer. As anyone who has seen Ducournau's films will know, the director uses the bodies of her characters as a form of expression, almost like choreography. As preparation for the role, the two worked together for nearly a year, focusing on the character's physicality and how the character arc could be displayed through body movement and gesture. According to the actress, Justine can be best compared to a panther that starts the film crouched in darkness and who later emerges to stand upright and become visible. Her metamorphosis through the film is really quite startling, and not just in the bigger moments such as these scenes where she is writhing in bed due to a skin rash or where she is dancing in front of the mirror. The metamorphosis is shown in more subtle ways too, such as the way she carries herself, her smaller gestures, and the micro-expressions that flash across her face as she watches the character of Adrian playing soccer. It is a brave and committed performance, and it is interesting to discover that as part of their preparation, Ducournau showed her Isabella Gianni's performance in the 1981 movie Possession to show how an actress can really let go of everything and enter the moment completely. With this amount of preparation, it is no wonder that Morellier was nominated for the César Award for Most Promising Actress. And to be frank, were the awards industry not so skewed against genre pictures, it really should have been more. Interestingly, the first drafts of the script had Justine studying not as a vet, but at medical school. However, Ducournau soon realised that the proximity and availability of human corpses in such a setting would make the acquisition of food far too easy, and the film would lose much of its tension. So the nature of the academy was switched. Justine's parents drop her off at the university and are very quick to leave, but the more observant will notice that her father is played by the actor Laurent Lucas, star of the Belgian horror movie Calvaire and the quite brilliant Hitchcockian thriller Harry, He's Here to Help, as well as the aforementioned body horror movie In My Skin. He reportedly took one look at the screenplay and signed on at once. From here, the film bursts into life. Justine and the rest of the new students are aggressively pulled from their beds and introduced to the dubious challenges of rush week. After being forced to crawl across campus, their tensions explode in a club sequence shot in one very hectic take, and which Ducournau has described as being the most technically difficult, but the most rewarding moment to shoot. Consisting of 300 extras and a full crew, the tightly enclosed location quickly became very claustrophobic. But what made the shoot different was the level of energy on set. Unlike most party or nightclub scenes, which are often shot in awkward silence and with no music, Ducournau insisted on blasting loud music throughout the day, only cutting it for moments of dialogue. This created a real atmosphere, and the result was a genuinely communal effort, including the director herself, who jumped on a table and danced at the start of filming to demonstrate what she wanted to achieve. Once the extras understood exactly what she was looking for, a nightclub scene that actually felt real, everyone threw themselves into it. They managed to get not one, but 2 perfect takes, which was far more than most directors could hope for. And when they did, the cast and extras erupted, still dancing even after the cameras stopped rolling. Adrian, Justine's roommate, is also introduced in this initial hazing sequence. Played by Rabah-Ney Ufella, he is a proudly gay man, introducing himself as a fag as the hazing begins and making out with a guy during the middle of the party. But his orientation is more than a mere plot device. It is instrumental for our perception of Justine, because he was written to be the audience perspective and the eyes of the viewer. Had he been heterosexual, the viewpoint would have immediately been sexualized, something that the director was eager to avoid. In fact, she went deliberately in the other direction. Justine's experimentation with him later in the film is shot from her perspective. It's about her curiosity and agency, and not the male gaze. Taking it even further, when we see the damage that occurs to the flesh in the film, whether it is the rash that appears on Justine's skin or the eye-watering bikini wax sequence, it is Ducournau's intention that we see this as a transgression to human flesh, and not just female. In Ducournau's world, we are all flesh, we are all one, and we are all the same. The hazing party is where we also first meet Justine's sister, Alexia, played by Ella Rumpf, although in the first 3 drafts of the movie, they were not sisters at all. However, the sadomasochistic nature of their relationship made little sense, and Ducournau struggled with the dynamic until it struck her that the 2 actually had to be sisters. The reason that Justine keeps returning to Alexia, despite her cruelty, is because she is going back to her blood and back to her roots, and much like in We Are What We Are, their blood relationship is one that is characterized by love, anger, hatred, contempt, and then back to love once again. The director has compared this dynamic to Greek myths and legends, noting that the brotherhood and sisterhood in these texts are always depicted as gory relationships and are always incredibly violent. And Alexia is certainly the embodiment of that. She is the one who makes Justine eat the rabbit kidney, initiating her not just into the ways of the academy, but also into what she will eventually become. As we discover, it was she who orchestrated the car accident at the beginning of the film, and she is also the one who is responsible for the movie's most brutal moments. These include another car accident, in which she attempts to initiate Justine into the world of cannibalism, and the eventual murder of Adrian. By the end of the movie, she is more animal than person, surrendering entirely to her base instincts, and killing Adrian not out of any emotional motive, but simply because she was hungry, and he was there. The cannibalism in the movie is most often seen as a metaphor for sexuality, but in reality, it is far more complicated than that. Unlike Trouble Every Day, Justine's sexuality does not awaken her cannibalism. Instead, she is freed to become a sexual being because she has made contact with the deepest and darkest part of herself. Whether the cannibalism is also a metaphor for consumption, love, adolescence, the darkness within, or something different altogether is very much down to the viewer. At the Toronto International Film Festival, when asked about the meaning, de Corneau declined to give a specific answer. In fact, she often says that she doesn't like to explain her films. However, she did say the following, quote, "If it hurts you, and by hurts you I mean in the good place, where you get interested and you want to know more, it means that it rings something in you. And this something is only yours. Because the movie is talking about something very archaic, these kind of desires, dark desires, and I think it can morph from person to person." End quote. What is certainly true of the film are the numerous references to man as animal, and one would be forgiven for assuming, as some have, that the film is an appeal for vegetarianism, although the director says that this is most certainly not the case. But the analogies of people being little more than livestock are certainly frequent. During rush week, these students are literally herded like cattle and forced to crawl, and there are many other scenes in the movie that also draw these parallels, most notably the imagery of the horse struggling in its cross ties as Justine's new appetites spring to life. Central to this awakening is Justine's relationship with Adrian, and, as he is the eyes of the audience, her relationship with the viewer. De Corneau has said that he is her favourite character in the film and was the easiest to write. He is essentially the sunshine of the movie, someone who sees the good in everyone. Ultimately, Adrian is the hero, albeit a tragic and sacrificial one, and his death is the force that drives Justine back to humanity. Their sexual experimentation is another reason that Adrian's character would be written as gay. Had he been heterosexual, their sexual congress would have been inevitable and predictable, something that de Corneau says would have ultimately been reductive. There has, of course, been some criticism from certain viewers about a gay man experimenting sexually with a woman, but for both characters the relationship is not so much sexual as it is all-encompassing. Their connection is based not on external factors, shared interests, or even orientation. It is one of inexplicable affinity. When the film was released, much emphasis was placed, incorrectly in my opinion, on the notion of explicit violence, and also whether people fainted at one of the premieres, which takes quite a lot away from the film, and is also rather deceptive to potential audiences. Whilst the subject matter is certainly intense, what makes Raw confronting is not just the special makeup effects, which are brilliantly done and largely practical as opposed to CGI, it's instead the intensity of the performances, the cinematography, and the realistic and direct fashion in which the director depicts the human body. And this is undoubtedly going to be uncomfortable for those more used to the gloss of Hollywood and the prettification of bodily functions. De Corneau has said that she was fed up with the way that women's sexuality is portrayed on screen, and Raw is very much her response to that. The film doesn't objectify or sanitize either Justine or Alexia. Instead, it shows them in all of their bodily reality. They bleed, they vomit, they pee by the roadside, they struggle with bikini waxing, they get drunk, and they get messy. As the director has put it, quote, "Women fart, poop, pee, and burp. They are real people with real feelings." End quote. And I think that it is this frankness which throws many viewers off balance, and just as they regain their footing, the cannibalism and special effects makeup then start knocking them down altogether. To be honest, for me, the most disturbing moments was not the finger sequence, nor the film's climax. It was the moment Justine vomits up human hair. This was again a practical in-camera effect, achieved by Marillier actually holding strands of prosthetic hair in her throat, which were mixed with dyed corn syrup. The result is actually, for me, one of the most unpleasant and unforgettable moments in the film, and no one is being eaten here at all. And not that I want to shatter anyone's illusions, but the finger and the leg that is eaten towards the end of the movie are actually made out of the same material as gummy bears, and pretty much everyone on set wanted to have a taste. The cinematography on Raw was led by Belgian director of photography Ruben Impens, and his work gives the film a very distinctive visual identity, one that constantly shifts between cold detachment and full-on lurid horror. Much of the film is lit in a harsh clinical style, with a very cool colour palette that makes everything feel just a little bit out of kilter. The dormitories and corridors of the universities are lit by sickly fluorescence, or thrown into deep shadow, which creates a sense of institutionalization and alienation. And then these are contrasted with moments that are the complete opposite, like the aforementioned club scene, which is chaotic, immersive, and completely disorientating. Much like our first film this week, Raw is also as much about family as it is about the monstrous. By the film's conclusion, we learn that their mother, too, struggled with the same cannibalistic hunger, implying that both daughters were fated to experience it. The final scene, in which their father wordlessly shows Justine the scars of her mother's bites, is a striking statement on unspoken family legacies and secrecy. The sisters were never warned, presumably to allow them a normal life as long as possible, but in the end, they only have each other to navigate what they are. This is certainly something that becomes more apparent with second viewing, with much of Alexia's behaviour cast in a new light. But where Justine finds her humanity in the monstrous, Alexia descends into base carnality. On one level, the film can be seen as a brief moment where the two sisters meet in the middle, as one rises and the other falls. Upon its release, the film was met with widespread critical acclaim. Early reviews from Cannes and Toronto praised Ducournau's bold vision and the film's mix of body horror and deeper meaning. Critics highlighted its feminist edge, dark humour, and striking visual style. It won major awards at various film festivals, including Cannes Critic Week and the BFI London Film Festival. Sadly, much of the film's notoriety came from reports of audience members reportedly fainting at early screenings, a story that Ducournau said was wildly overblown. Sadly, the myth stuck, and at some US screenings, vomit bags were handed out as part of the marketing, proving, if nothing else, that the legacy of William Castle has never quite died away. Box office returns were respectable for a subtitled genre film, with the film earning roughly $3 million worldwide. More importantly, it established Ducournau as a major new voice in international cinema. In 2021, her second feature, Titan, won the Palme d'Or at Cannes, making her the first female solo director to ever win the award. Titan is a provocative fusion of body horror and melodrama, and confirmed her status as one of the most innovative and uncompromising directors of her generation. We Are What We Are and Raw are incredibly important landmarks in the cannibal subgenre, using the taboo theme to explore family relationships, society, sexuality, and wider questions about the nature of humanity. In We Are What We Are, Alfredo is reluctantly forced to assume the patriarchal role in his cannibalistic family, while simultaneously coming to terms with his sexual orientation. Ultimately, the film highlights the violent pressure of masculinity and family expectations. He is ultimately triggered into action by a note handed to him by a subway busker that tells him simply, "You are alive." It is this note that he passes to Sabina when he attacks her as a cover to ensure that she can safely escape from the police, surrendering his own life in the process. In Raw, Justine's affliction also runs in the family, passed down from her mother and acting as a metaphor not only for sexual awakening, but an emotional coming of age. In doing so, she selects the opposite route to her sister, realizing that true humanity is a choice and not a birthright. And watching both movies in succession, one would not be at all surprised to see a copy of the very same note in Justine's hand at the end of the film. Cannibal horror has seen a notable resurgence from the 2010s onwards, with a surprising number of films exploring the theme from various angles. In 2013, The Green Inferno from Eli Roth made a rather heavy-handed homage to the Italian cannibal films of the 1970s, while 2 years later, the film Bone Tomahawk in 2015 brought the cannibal theme into the horror-western hybrid genre, with Kurt Russell and Patrick Wilson confronting a brutal troglodyte tribe that eats human flesh. This trend continued to flourish in the 2020s, with films like Bones and All in 2022, which offered a coming-of-age twist on the cannibal narrative. The movie Fresh, also in 2022, further dissected the horrors of cannibalism through a darkly comedic lens, exploring modern dating as well as human consumption. And a quick search on the Internet Movie Database reveals that the subgenre shows no signs of fading, with numerous other entries exploring everything from supernatural cannibalism to visceral psychological horror. If nothing else, it would appear that the appetite for these types of movies remains as voracious as ever. And that brings us to the end of another episode. Thank you for listening, and I hope I haven't put you off your dinner, lunch, or breakfast whenever you happen to be hearing this. If you've enjoyed the episode, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and also remember to follow our Instagram, The Horror Double Bill, for more information, movie trailers, and behind-the-scenes info. You can also email the show at thehorrordouble@gmail.com. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to friend of the pod and YouTuber Katie of the Night for her support of the show. If you've come over based on her recommendation, welcome. It's great to have you here. And if you aren't following Katie's channel, I highly suggest that you do. She posts regular reviews of cult movies, giallo, and exploitation cinema, and has a great perspective on all of the films she discusses. I'll also link her channel in the show notes. Next week, we will be exploring the nature of reality with 2 mind-bending films designed to mess with your heads. First up, we will be discussing independent British psychological thriller The Ghoul from 2016. Now, there are several films out there called The Ghoul, so look for the one starring Tom Meaton and Alice Lowe. It's available for free on Tubi, and it's also available for rental on YouTube and the usual streaming services. And then after that, we are heading out to sea with Melissa George in Triangle from 2009 and from director Christopher Smith. This also features a very early appearance from a young Liam Hemsworth and is currently available, as of the time of recording, to watch on Plex, YouTube, and other popular streaming services. So if you want to watch ahead, make sure that you pay full attention, as there's a lot to wrap your head around in both films. And yes, I've just realised that yet again, both of these movies are from this century. But don't worry, we'll be back in the 1900s before you know it. I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you so much for listening, and have a really, really great day. Goodbye.